As discussed in the previous lesson, political debate was not an endeavor to be approached without proper preparation. It required careful education and training. Humanists believed that individuals needed to be thoroughly educated in both moral philosophy and rhetoric to engage effectively in the political sphere. Moral philosophy, or ethics, was a fundamental component of humanist education, designed to equip individuals with the ability to make informed decisions, particularly in complex and challenging situations. For the humanists, all decisions, whether political, economic, or social, were fundamentally ethical in nature. This perspective underscored the belief that every choice was, at its core, a moral one, requiring careful consideration and judgment. The emphasis on moral philosophy was crucial because it was seen as the source of the discernment, answers, and solutions necessary to function as an effective citizen or leader. The development of a moral consciousness provided the foundation for sound judgment, enabling individuals to navigate the ethical dimensions of every decision and thereby contribute meaningfully to the governance and well-being of the city. Thus, in the humanist view, the capacity for ethical reasoning was not just a personal virtue, but a civic necessity. It empowered individuals to act wisely and justly, aligning their personal actions with the broader goals of public life and communal responsibility. For the humanists, the most critical skill was proficiency in writing and speaking. This emphasis on eloquence was so powerful that the Visconti family, rulers of Milan, accused the humanists' rhetorical abilities of causing more harm to the Milanese army than the entire Florentine cavalry. Contrary to the common perception, espoused by scholars like Jacob Burckhardt, that Renaissance humanism was primarily a philosophical or anti-clerical movement, many historians today argue that humanism should not be seen as an ideological program. Instead, they view it as an educational program focused on acquiring knowledge and developing linguistic skills, including philology and grammar. A central element of this humanist education was rhetoric, which can be understood as the art of speaking. The primary reason for training in rhetoric was to enable individuals to effectively communicate and convey the knowledge they possessed. The humanist educational model, often summarized by the phrase sapientia et eloquentia, translated as wisdom and eloquence, held that wisdom was synonymous with moral philosophy, while eloquence referred to the skill of rhetoric. To cultivate both rhetorical skill and moral philosophy, it was deemed essential to return to the classical texts of antiquity. Engaging with classical literature, ranging from poetry to prose, was considered indispensable because it provided the foundation for understanding and mastering the classical ideals. Through this study, humanists believed they could attain the necessary tools for persuasive communication and ethical reasoning, thereby fostering both individual and civic excellence. A significant challenge faced by the humanists of the Renaissance was the limited access to classical texts, and their scarcity further compounded this issue. It is important to note that these classical works were not entirely unknown in the Middle Ages. They were indeed read, but the approach to them was fundamentally different from that of the Renaissance. While the classics were available in the medieval period, the purpose and method of their study differed greatly from the humanist approach in the Renaissance. So, what exactly was different between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in this regard? Firstly, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, a considerable number of Roman classical texts were either lost or fell into obscurity, often languishing in some remote monastic library where few had access to them. The scarcity of these texts posed a significant barrier to their study and dissemination. This scenario might evoke images from the film adaptation of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, where a hidden monastic library conceals forgotten books, accessible only to a privileged few. Despite their scarcity, classical works were used in medieval education, particularly because the classical rhetorical tradition was preserved as part of the literary curriculum. However, the way these texts were employed was markedly different from how Renaissance humanists approached them. In medieval education, students were required, often rigidly so, to memorize specific passages deemed important, typically sentences that conveyed particular sentiments or expressions. This method emphasized rote learning, where the focus was on memorization rather than understanding or critical reflection. Unlike the humanists, medieval scholars did not encourage analytical thinking or intellectual engagement with the content. By the late Middle Ages, there was a gradual departure from this method of rote memorization. The focus shifted toward using classical texts as models of style. The goal was to imitate the stylistic qualities of these texts, thereby improving one's ability to write in a refined Latin style. It was not necessary to memorize passages verbatim. Instead, students were encouraged to emulate the stylistic elegance of renowned authors such as Livy and Cicero. In doing so, they became more skilled rhetoricians. This was the medieval approach to classical works. They were studied not for their substantive ideas or intellectual content, but to cultivate a superior Latin style. This divergence in purpose and approach represents a profound difference between medieval and Renaissance education. While medieval scholars used classical texts primarily for linguistic training, Renaissance humanists saw them as rich sources of intellectual and philosophical ideas, worthy of critical engagement and study. The Renaissance humanists adopted the structure of the classical Roman education, emphasizing the importance of cultivating educated, active citizens who could contribute meaningfully to society, similar to the ideals of democratic Athens and republican Rome. To make informed decisions and participate fully in civic life, they argued, one must be educated in the 7 liberal arts, which were traditionally divided into 2 main categories. The first category, known as the trivium, encompassed grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These subjects were considered essential for effective communication, forming the foundation of eloquence, eloquentia in Latin. The second category, the quadrivium, included 4 subjects: mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. These disciplines provided the knowledge and ideas necessary to develop sound judgment and decision-making skills, allowing individuals to understand and articulate complex concepts clearly. Renaissance humanists embraced these classical arts, retaining the trivium as critical to a well-rounded education. However, they expanded the scope of the quadrivium by incorporating additional subjects, such as poetry and history, while maintaining the underlying principles. These were the essential fields of study that all citizens needed to learn to become responsible and virtuous members of society. This educational program was referred to by the humanists as Studia Humanitatis, which can be translated literally as the study of humanity, or more aptly, the study of what it means to be human. At its core, this was the central concern for the Renaissance humanists: to educate individuals in a manner that allowed them to achieve their highest potential and to become better human beings. The humanists' goal was for every person to realize their fullest potential, believing that education was the means to ensure that each individual's potential was fully developed. However, achieving this required the cultivation of both the intellect and the will. These 2 components, intellect and will, were regarded by humanists as the most critical elements of human transformation, and both needed to be nurtured equally. This balanced approach led to the inclusion of moral philosophy and rhetoric in the curriculum. The intellect was to be shaped by knowledge, providing the ideas and information necessary for sound judgment and decision-making. Equally important, however, was the will, which needed to be inspired and motivated to act correctly, ensuring that individuals made morally right decisions. This emphasis on the will represents a fundamental difference between Renaissance and medieval education. Medieval philosophers often considered the intellect as the primary focus of education, believing that educating the intellect alone was sufficient. The humanists strongly disagreed with this view, arguing that without properly forming and motivating the will to do what is right, intellectual knowledge would be useless if one could not put it into practice. For the Renaissance humanist, both elements were necessary. One must possess the right knowledge and also the motivation to apply it effectively in practice. This focus on the will is one reason why rhetoric was so highly valued by the humanists. The humanist education, Studia Humanitatis, was therefore designed to foster both intellectual and moral development. It was seen as crucial not only for the individual who would become a fully developed person, but also for society as a whole, which needed educated and virtuous citizens and leaders to thrive. In our next lecture, we'll explore the origins of humanism within the medieval scholastic tradition. We'll see how Renaissance thinkers transformed the concept of humanism, shaping it to emphasize personal development, civic duty, and a revived connection with the classical heritage.